Hello everyone, good morning, good evening, good day, depending on when you're watching this. So as you can see on screen here, this reading will be on a paper written by Commander L.R. Bremseth, United States Navy, and this was written on April 20th or April 28th, 2001. And it says, submitted in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the Marine Corps War College, Marine Corps University, Marine Corps Combat Development Command in Quantico, Virginia. And there's a disclaimer here that just says this doesn't reflect the total views of the government. However, this was a paper that was authored, I suppose, as one of the requirements for either graduation or submission into another program or something like that. But the title of the paper is Unconventional Human Intelligence Support, Transcendent and Asymmetric Warfare Implications of Remote Viewing. And this is still available online. I'll provide that link and the credits from the author, from the commander here, in the description of the YouTube video. So I'm just going to get right into it. Abstract. Concerned that a psychical PSI in parentheses gap existed between U.S. and Soviet paranormal research efforts, the CIA sponsored discrete research into paranormal phenomena commencing in 1972. Over the succeeding 23 years, the U.S. military and intelligence services were actively involved in paranormal research and operations involving a process known as remote viewing. Remote viewing, which produced specialized human intelligence support, served as part of overall military and government organizations' intelligence collection efforts. In 1995, after assuming remote viewing program management responsibilities from the DIA, the CIA decided to terminate the program based on a controversial review conducted by the American Institutes for Research. Yet, remote viewing's demonstrated capacity for providing unique, non-technical intelligence support posits said program as a leading candidate for exploring currently evolving forms of warfare. Presented within is a brief history of the remote viewing program, an examination of its evolution over the course of more than 23 years, and a discussion of its continuing relevance to national security and emerging warfare trends. So I'll just pause right here for a minute. The CIA and the DIA were not the only ones involved, and they were not the first. The Navy, which is where the commanders, I guess, enlisted, the Navy was already ahead of this, and what appears to, from what we've read from other documents, what we're told from stories and things like that, anecdotes, were already involved in this in the 30s and 40s as a result of discovering that pilots under duress were inadvertently affecting their equipment while they were, trying to operate their equipment, and that it was some sort of psychic phenomena occurring where they weren't unable to determine a fault within the equipment and sort of had to start taking a little bit further. And then with that said, a little bit further back, we know that a lot of sacred texts and religious texts all speak of various modalities of mental phenomena in parapsychology and psychical and psychic phenomena. But it's not mentioned in this very often that the NSA was already doing research within the 50s and 60s as it related to psychical research, and that through, I guess we could just say, common lore of World War II and the Germans were also involved in this, and it's often labeled as occult research, but we now know that that's not what was happening. It wasn't occult research at all, or demons or anything like that. And then further back we have things like alchemy and most famously John Dee, Frank Bacon, or Francis Bacon, people involved in what we might call secret societies or esoteric societies, but all sort of in one fashion or another documenting various aspects of psychic phenomena through coded language as it related to religious, spiritual, alchemical, and mental learned processes that a lot of them were developing tools or trying to create tools to help themselves better understand what was going on, but also to teach other people. And then the much further back, some of the Egyptian and I guess we'll just say Middle Eastern texts as they reference their older initiation processes and I guess their form of sciences back then is an appropriate term. And while this paragraph here says that the DIA had it, what actually happened is, from what I've learned actually in the past year, is there were a couple organizations in New York City that were, or foundations, private foundations, were running their own tests, and these tests had managed to make their way out to Stanford Research Institute into California. Word of that got out, and the CIA then came in as a sponsor, co-sponsor of these tests, and then after the CIA passed it on to the DIA, as well as the Army and the Navy, just through different committees, Senate committees, and debriefings to the intelligence committees, the DIA then came in and took over an aspect of the program or started to run their own program, and then it was circled back to the CIA. And the commander mentions a controversial review conducted by the American Institutes for Research, and we'll read through that. He's written a little bit about that. And if you can read this review in the CIA's publicly available CIA CREST library, which is a Freedom of Information library. And I've read that. It's pretty farcical. It's the most uninformed evaluation of a 23-year plus program. And I'm going to say it now because we'll get to it in the commander's paper here. But it's clear that it seems like it was self-sabotaged for many reasons, and the commander sort of says similar, or has a similar conclusion. But the report seems like just an effort to shut it all down or to take it into a black project or a black budget project. All right, so the table of contents, I'll just leave this up on screen for a minute. You can pause it. And then we have 3 drawings at the end. All right, so prologue. From 1972 until 1995, United States military and intelligence organizations conducted paranormal research and operations involving a process known as remote viewing. Remote viewing is generally recognized within the scientific community as the psychic ability to access and provide accurate information, regardless of distance, shielding, or time, about people, places, objects, or events inaccessible through any normal, recognized means. Official confirmation of government participation in such research occurred in 1995 when a small portion of the voluminous classified research material was made publicly available via the Freedom of Information Act. Paranormal research involving parapsychological and psychical functioning has been perceived a controversial field by American academia and scientific communities who have met its reported results with outright dismissal, skepticism, or methodical and methodological criticism. Since both the military and the intelligence agencies pursue efforts deemed acceptable risks, their involvement with remote viewing therefore sparks curiosity. What made the risk of potential ridicule by association acceptable? This paper reviews remote viewing's evolution, examines why and how United States military and intelligence agencies became involved in its controversial application as a unique human intelligence support method, and explores its heretofore unrecognized status as an important and possibly revolutionary form of warfare with asymmetrical implications. The Soviets, Central Intelligence Agency, and Stanford Research Institute, the Psi Gap or PSI Gap. During the late 1960s, the United States intelligence community became concerned about a perceived disparity between U.S. and Soviet exploration and exploitation of paranormal phenomena. Intelligence information revealed that the Soviets were funding research at an estimated level equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars that involved at least 9 and possibly up to 14 major research centers. Much of the U.S. concern focused on who was involved with the Soviet research as opposed to what they were actually doing, particularly when U.S. officials discovered that the KGB and GRU were controlling the research. We have a couple notes in there. So Ingo Swann is mentioned. I guess he published a book, which I have not read. I'll move on. Their anxiety was amplified by knowledge that Soviets did not routinely invest at these levels, both monetarily and organizationally, for non-productive programs devoted to pure research. In 1969, while participating in a scientific conference at Big Sur, California, a leading Soviet scientist presented a research paper that, when subsequently analyzed by the U.S. intelligence community, indicated the Soviets were involved in some form of distant influencing with mind control implications. The Soviets' organizational and funding commitment to paranormal or psychic research, and the lack of any corresponding U.S. effort, created a perceived psi gap. Further, this gap and its corresponding potential for Soviet breakthroughs were deemed to pose a national security threat that the United States could not afford to dismiss out of hand, inasmuch as the research was being funded and directed by Soviet security services. Specifically, the U.S. intelligence community was concerned that the Soviets may have developed the ability to replicate psychic phenomena and to harness its potential. This threat, in an area of research that had historically been disregarded by American academia and scientific communities, prompted American intelligence services to begin accelerating efforts for a counterpart U.S. program. So a couple points there. 1969. We know that and this is in previous videos posted on this YouTube channel, the experiments with Pavlov, or what's more commonly known as Pavlovian experiments, yielded probably a basis for some of this research on the Soviet side. And then looking at the time frame again in 1969, 20 years prior in World War II, what has been documented as Nazi or German research. It's sort of been in mythos stated that a lot of that research was divided up among the U.S. and Russia, what they had confiscated from the Germans. Now again, though, this information in itself, in totality, the notion of psychic ability or telepathy or telekinesis, has been around for hundreds of years. If we just use the word oracle or soothsayer or prophecy or magician, wizard, all of these things are sort of synonymous in that realm of psychic phenomena or parapsychology, as it's referred to today. So I'm stating that because the intelligence agencies here are just getting involved in it, or starting to get money behind it and start developing programs and research. But the books that were circulating for at least 300 years among, let's say, the affluent or the nobles or the wealthy in, say, the 16, 17, 1800s, it means that there was family knowledge, right? That there were, whether you want to call them the elders or the ancients or the families, the quote-unquote the families, or the secret fraternities of all known religious groups, this knowledge has existed there. Why it is being presented that the intelligence agencies are just getting into it, it's summed up in this sentence where the commander says that it wasn't really, it was always shot down and disseminated as some sort of hoopla, or just not respected in any fashion. I've said this before, I think it's because of the religious control of the United States where this kind of research is basically demonized, and I use that word specifically. And that certainly has probably created initially created that gap. And going back to the Pavlovian stuff, when you first go through some of those videos, if you had the chance to go through them or just to download that document and read it for yourself, it's clear in there that he says the materialists had taken over much earlier than many people think. And he ties that materialism back to the notions of religious dogma, because the fundamental idea there being that the argument of soul and spirit versus mind and body, and how one doesn't exist here. One only exists after you're given permission to go to heaven or anything like that. And while that sounds spiritual, and you say, well, how's that materialistic? Well, it's materialistic because it boxes it up. It boxes up the soul separate. It sort of indemnifies the entire process of ascension. And that's how you should define that when you hear people say that religion or spirituality or ascension or New Age thinking have become materialistic. It's in the idea that everything is independent of everything else. And if you're already deeply immersed in this kind of research, or you yourself have experienced these things, you know that everything is connected, in fact, and that the idea of separating it all is a construct of the mind. Or in some cases, abuse and fear and ignorance, so to speak, is what is. And I don't mean ignorance in a negative connotation, but I mean in our attempts to then deconstruct what we experience, see, feel, think, make. It has, our approach initially to that is to start to label things and box it up and put them in a specific quadrant to allow us to begin to organize the broader picture or the broader perception or the broader experience itself. However, what has happened is that while that as a sort of mechanical means of figuring things out is helpful, we're sort of lost in that micro and macrocosm of the box, whether it's a big box or a little box, a big idea or a little idea, where we've forgotten to perceive it as a whole and then go back and sort of tie it all together and see how it fits together. So we're on CIA involvement now, next paragraph. You'll see that these are all short paragraphs. It's about 22 pages, but the commander did a good job of just sort of keeping a lot of superfluous text, which I am now adding with my dialogue over on top of his paper here, but it's hopefully complementing some of the things that he's saying. So CIA involvement. Given prevailing attitudes towards psychic phenomena, the CIA did not know where to begin in measuring and or quantifying psychical occurrences. Since most Western scientists generally regarded this whole area of endeavor as nonsense, the CIA thus began to look for a discrete research laboratory operating outside of established academia, which could manage a quiet, classified research effort. At the time, the Stanford Research Institute, Milano Park, California, was conducting annually funded government research, so it seemed a perfect match for the CIA's purpose. In 1972, several CIA officers approached Dr. Hal Puthoff. Excuse me. Dr. Hal Puthoff, a SRI laser research physicist and former naval intelligence officer who had worked for the National Security Agency. Owing to Puthoff's military and scientific credentials, the agents confided to him their concerns regarding Soviet research efforts in parapsychology that the CIA had been monitoring for over a decade. Let's stop there. Puthoff is often referred to in most of the commercially available books written by some of the participants of these programs as a research physicist, but here, and probably unknown to the chagrin of Ingo Swann himself, who is a noted remote viewer, or maybe even Uri Geller, another noted psychical researcher at that time, is referred to as a naval intelligence officer and an NSA employee. So this institute, this SRI, was clearly already involved in stuff, like I said at the beginning of this video. And a lot of that is a result of, it's often said and written online. I haven't really read many books that go through it yet, and it's just because I may not have crossed these books. But the intelligence agents in certain departments, we'll say, within their own organizations, often have to go through, I don't want to say occult training, but they have to learn about some of the more ancient cryptological and cryptographic aspects of those older documents I mentioned in books that circulated in the 16, 17, 1800s, as well as many, many books and research papers that were written in the 1800s by actual military officers, both in Europe, Britain, and the United States, where there were actual military officers writing books about their experiences with psychical research and parapsychological phenomena. So at some point, whether the military wanted to accept it or not, I'm sure that their libraries, even as early as then, contain these documents. So I'm not going to say the word Nazi too much more often. I'm going to refer to them respectfully as Germans, but they were not the only ones familiar with this or in effect practicing any sort of quote-unquote occult knowledge. And it's not fair to continue to push that narrative overall. So the next paragraph. The CIA's interest in SRI and Puthoff had been piqued by a report Puthoff had drafted earlier that year regarding his observations of Ingo Swann, a New York artist and reported psychic. Puthoff invited Swann to visit SRI after they had corresponded regarding experiments to investigate the boundary between the physics of the animate and inanimate. Prior to Swann's SRI visit, and without Swann's knowledge, Puthoff arranged for access to a shielded magnetometer used in quark detection experiments by Stanford University's Psychics or Physics Department. Quark experimentation required that the magnetometer be as well shielded as technologically possible to preclude outside influences. While visiting the laboratory as part of Swann's facilities tour, Puthoff challenged Swann, who had claimed that he could perform psychokinesis, to see if he could affect the magnetometer, as it could not be affected from the outside by normal means. Intrigued by the challenge, Swann observed the magnetometer in a manner that eventually became known as remote viewing, and, with a pencil and paper, sketched the interior of its therefore unpublished construction. According to Puthoff, the magnetometer went berserk during Swann's sketching. Essentially, the output signal from the magnetometer became visibly disturbed, demonstrating a disturbance in the internal magnetic field. Astonished, Puthoff asked what Swann had done. Swann replied that he had done nothing but look at it. When Puthoff asked Swann for a repeat performance, the magnetometer again reacted in the same manner. Later, Puthoff reported Swann's remote viewing demonstration had impressed him even more than the magnetometer's reaction. Apparently the CIA was impressed as well, for several weeks later, its representatives approached Puthoff. Excuse me, let me take a drink here. So this story, this one paragraph, or these 3 paragraphs in this one section here, has actually been expounded upon almost in full in a separate book by Ingo Swann. And to summarize, I'll try to be brief here, is what happened during Swans tests as a New York artist in the New York organizations doing psychical research is, in being an artist, he realized that trying to describe what he was seeing verbally was making the test seem errant or just difficult for the researchers to understand whether or not he was making accurate guesses or demonstrating his ability fully. So he was the one who introduced doing ideograms and drawings and little sketches of what he saw instead of trying to talk about it and describe it. And from there on, mostly everything he drew corresponded almost identically with whatever he was tasked with. So he was able to, for example, something was put inside of a box, no one knew it was in the box, anybody. There was a light that was put inside the box to illuminate the interior of the box, and then he would have to project himself into that box or remote view whatever was in there. And then instead of talking about it or writing it down in words, he would draw what he saw, which would eliminate any mistranslation in syntax or taxonomy of words. And all those drawings were mostly corresponding with whatever was tasked in the box as something worth finding. And this also later evolved into locations and places where people would give a little bit of verbiage, talk it out a little bit, and then also do a drawing of what they saw. The magnetometer, they actually had a device inside the room, and that was actually monitoring it in real time. And when he remote viewed the device, that disturbance, whether his presence, let's just call it his presence, or his eye as it went into the shielded room or basement down below them, which incidentally is allegedly under walls of concrete in material, because the magnetometer itself was used for measuring, I think, earthquakes, so it had to be shielded in a specific way. So the meter that was monitoring this went off as he was beginning to draw the picture, meaning as he made a connection to his distant self in this room looking at this device, the magnetometer, that energetic effect is what affected the magnetometer, then causing the instrument above where all the scientists were sitting with him. It's not mentioned in this paper, but there were actually other scientists in the room who then, after witnessing it, Puthoff had asked them to sign the actual printout, the readout that was recorded, just as sort of evidence to show that there were not only other witnesses in the room, but other scientists had confirmed that this was a real phenomenon. Excuse me again. The way ahead. The CIA officers asked Puthoff if he could arrange for them to test Swan via some simple experiments. The CIA's intent was to determine if paranormal phenomena were in fact replicable in a controlled environment. Further, if the experiments proved successful, would Puthoff be willing to manage a pilot program with CIA funding? After agreeing to consider this second request, Puthoff, aided by Russell Targ, a fellow physicist with a long-term interest in involvement with parapsychology, set about arranging the testing of Swan. Well, I wonder if the CIA knew that, I guess they would have known that Puthoff was previously naval intelligence as well as connected to the NSA, I would hope, because they often, all those groups often infiltrate one another and I guess confiscate or infiltrate research from one another. I don't know how to say it in a polite way, but intercept cross-agency research, let's say that. Conducted shortly thereafter, Swan's initial tests were rather basic in that he was tasked to describe objects hidden in a box. Swan performed successfully enough to warrant the CIA providing $49,000, $50K essentially, for an 8-month biofield measurements study, which is in fact a cover for the study and research of remote viewing. So biofield measurements was some of the terminology, closer to the terminology that the USSR was using. And the USSR, or Russia itself, was having problems doing their research because they too had a religious component within their country that was stopping all of this, essentially, was, saying, there's a stigma, to use that word specifically, a stigma against this research. So everyone had begun at some point to change the language a little bit and make it more reflective of actual scientific phenomena versus just calling things psychic or an aura. You know, they say it's a biofield measurement, and that does make more sense. It is more approachable from the scientific community, but we later find out too that again these programs were sabotaged from within because of the religious aspects and because of what the research might reveal in terms of what a lot of people are told about spirituality and religious belief systems. The physicists take charge. The biofield measurements study initially began with SRI's remote viewers describing objects in envelopes and boxes, similar to the initial testing of Swan. These methods, however, evolved into what became known as outbound remote viewing. In outbound remote viewing, a target person would travel to a location, generally one in the San Francisco Bay Area, which was known to the remote viewer, who remained within the confines of an SRI laboratory along with a monitor. The outbound target person was sent to various randomly selected sites under strict protocols designed to prevent biased or contaminated results. At a designated time with the remote viewer would attempt to describe the target person's location. Normally, these descriptions were both oral and in the form of drawings intended to depict features of the target site. Upon the experiment's completion, the remote viewer and all other participants traveled to the target site so that the remote viewer could see firsthand how close his or her mental images actually matched the target. The experiment was conducted on a double-blind basis, meaning the target site remained unknown to both the SRI experimenters and remote viewers alike. Using double-blind protocol procedures to preclude artifactual results, maybe artificial, artifactual, SRI employed independent judges to evaluate the remote viewer's success and accuracy. Additionally, the CIA employed its own members as contract monitors to observe the ongoing SRI research to ensure strict protocols and procedures were followed so as to preclude any potential chicanery. Yeah, that's a word I haven't heard in a while, chicanery. That means fuckery. Excuse me, guys. But unfortunately, the chicanery here, we later learned, was actually because they were using their own employees and that they were all infiltrating each other. As mentioned, the FBI is not referenced here, but as mentioned earlier in this video, the various intelligence groups were all sharing information. Hoover was briefed on some of this research as early as the 50s, and they themselves, as an intelligence apparatus, were probably experiencing some pretty interesting phenomena. And as what is more commonly known among all of us is that a lot of unsolved cases and unsolved mysteries, many times the intelligence apparatuses, including police departments, which again are just another intelligence apparatus, they would use psychics and people to help solve these crimes. And some of those popular and very famous psychics were involved in these studies themselves, and we'll see that later on, or read that later on. Remote viewing goes operational. Coordinated remote viewing, which is also known as CRV. Ingo Swann was the driving force behind the development of coordinated remote viewing, or the ability to remote view using geographic coordinates, in lieu of an outbound target person at a designated location serving as a sort of beacon. According to Puthoff, Swann felt his abilities were not being tested or utilized to their fullest potential, especially during the early stages of the remote viewing experiments. Consequently, Swann made suggestions that helped the program develop and mature. Eventually, Swann also confided that he could remote view anywhere on the planet and beyond its limits, a statement Puthoff initially considered preposterous. In response, Swann suggested an experiment was needed to determine whether someone was required at the target site during a remote viewing experiment, and recommended a remote viewing of planet Jupiter prior to the upcoming NASA Pioneer 10 flyby. During this experiment, Swan described a ring around Jupiter and at first thought he might have remotely viewed Saturn by mistake. Astronomers and others readily dismissed Swan's description until the subsequent NASA 10 flyby revealed that the ring, in fact, existed. From this initial effort, the protocols were expanded and numerous experiments were conducted using geographic coordinates, latitude and longitude in degrees, minutes, and seconds. ScanNet, short for scanning for coordinates, was the name given to this method for remote viewing. When provided with the geographic coordinates for any location on the planet, the remote viewer was able to describe the location in as much detail as possible. One of the major challenges facing the SRR team with this form of remote viewing was developing protocols to preclude the possibility of a remote viewer somehow memorizing all of the world's geographic coordinates. Using Ingo Swann and Pat Price, another remote viewer, SRI conducted a long-range operational test of the ScanNet procedures for the CIA during 1973. The purpose of this experiment was to determine remote viewing effectiveness under conditions that approximated an operational scenario. The experiment's results were profound, significantly impacting not only SRI's remote viewing program, but also the CIA support it received. The target site coordinates were for a West Virginia mountain home owned by a CIA employee. However, Swan and Price, located at SRI in Milano Park, described a nearby facility that, in their opinion, was more interesting. The site proved to be a highly sensitive National Security Agency facility, and both Swan and Price were accurate in their physical descriptions of the facility, as well as in their identification of its general purpose. Additionally, Price penetrated a secured vault and thereby obtained the facility's code name along with those of various programs, one of which was extremely sensitive. He also accessed the names of individuals who worked at the facility, but this information proved to be inaccurate. Such was the result of the first ever long-distance operational remote viewing test accomplished by SRI during the initial pilot program for the CIA. So I'm going to back up here, because I have a few contentions myself with this research. While I certainly support it and believe it, coming from, say, the hacker's mentality, I just always look for ways that I could have pulled this off myself without anybody knowing that I was bluffing. First of all the NASA stuff, I don't know how. Well, let's go a little further back. This coordinates using longitude and latitude. I would need to know how supposedly giving somebody a bunch of random numbers in two separate strings, one being latitude, one being longitude, is providing them a method for pinpointing a location on the globe. Just think about that for a minute. Why couldn't I have just said, here's XP123-4 and 7-ABQRTP? I mean, what association, what are these latitude and longitude degrees referencing on the spiritual plane or the mental plane that is allowing the remote viewer to find a location? And this may have been answered somewhere, this may be answered somewhere, but I don't see how the man-made tool of latitude and longitude along the globe is providing someone on the ethereal or spiritual or parapsychological level the ability then to, there's no correspondence between that. Does that make sense to everybody? I hope it does. There's just no functional correspondence at all there. Those are just random numbers. Like if you're not someone who's familiar with geography, or you just never even been a traveler at all, how would you use longitude and latitude as an anchor to pinpoint a location? Unless, does that make sense? And there's certain, I could be being a little bit too materialistic about it, but I don't see that. Now, the other thing with NASA, coming back to NASA, there was so much art generated by NASA in books, in photography books, and coffee table books. And Ingo Swann himself was an artist who was known for painting space scenes and space art related to space and stuff like that. I mean, it's obvious that he had a knowledge, a predisposition to this stuff, which was itself, these books, oftentimes just renderings and drawings, which have been admitted to by NASA of what they expected to find or expected to see, that there was no actual photograph that had not been manipulated in some fashion or another, if not created entirely from scratch, from the imagination of someone else. And I'm just taking this from the surface level because that's how any common or average person would probably approach this if they were trying to debunk it. I don't think it's irrational or illogical to say that being in New York, being an artist, especially an artist who was painting pictures of space and the galaxy and things like that, and sort of quote-unquote inspired to paint these things, how, I mean, again, you have to use someone, or not again, but you have to find someone who has no knowledge of space or no predisposition of it or no previous attempts to create it in their own mind from an artistic level. They have to almost be a blank slate to validate the fact that the phenomena exists, or that he saw Jupiter. And even if you don't have the words, I mean the artwork created by NASA at this time as well, we have, which Ingo himself said he read a lot of, the more esoteric texts of Kepler and Newton and those people who, with very articulate language, were able to describe planets and their theories on what they saw. And I understand people were using telescopes and things like that, and they might have perceived those things, but even that photography and those hand drawings existed previously or prior to Ingo Swann describing these things. So there's just a little bit here, and I'm not saying that this one paragraph should prove it all wrong, but this is how, if you wanted to, you would approach sort of debunking it, or at least for your own edification, coming at it reasonably and logically. So with that said, I'm going to stop right here. This one's gotten a little long, and I'll pick up the next video on a Soviet target.